the civilian to combat kill ratio is one I want to talk to you guys about tonight, because this is astonishing. Right now, at this point, look at this graph. This is how many civilians have been killed. Now that we've had a bit of a pause with the ceasefire and they're able to count more and they're able to kind of go in and see all the demise, the destruction, the corpses, it's just so terrible. There's been a better count of how many people have been killed, and this count continues to get updated. This is from the Euromed Human Rights Monitor. We're on day 52 of the conflict of the Israeli, they call it the genocide war in Gaza Strip. I wouldn't call it something different. Actually, it's quite, by definition, it does seem to be. Unless, there's still time for Israel to change and for this to not turn into a genocide. Certainly, there's still time for that. We should always speak out against a genocide before the genocide happens, not after. That's what people say about the Holocaust. They look at and they say, "Oh, we should have said something. We should have said more." Well, now is the time to speak up before it turns into that. But at this point, 20,360 people, civilians, have been killed in Gaza. That is 8,241 children. 8,241 children, 4,126 women, and 18,940 civilians total is what they're saying have been killed. So if the number of civilians, so I want you to focus in on that. Now, the number of where they're getting combatants actually is coming from Israel themselves. So according to this, they're saying that it's 18,940 civilians to 20,360 total killed. The numbers of where they're getting the combatants, so that's only about 1,000 to 1,500 combatants from what we're saying. That is coming from the Israelis, their own source, their own data right now is showing, here's the Guardian piece, says Israel's military estimates that it has killed between 1,000 and 2,000 Hamas fighters out of a military force it believes is about 30,000 strong. So they've only been able to kill 1,000 to 2,000, so we'll say 1,500, out of the 30,000 Hamas fighters. Meanwhile, again, 19,000 civilians. So 1,500 fighters, 19,000 civilians is how many they have. That's the ratio of that is the largest civilian to combatant ratio in any war ever by a lot. World War II, you thought that was carnage. This is worse. This civilian to combatant ratio is the worst we've ever seen. Let's go over some of the first before we go over these numbers, by the way. People are going to say, well, those are Hamas's numbers. You can't trust Hamas's numbers. Even the president doesn't trust Hamas's numbers. And if you remember, Joe Biden came out saying, I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. Remember when he said that? He's like, well, this is Hamas. And that has been sort of now whenever civilian numbers are given or just casualty numbers are given, people are quick to say, oh, well, that's Hamas-run Ministry of Health in order to somehow delegitimize those numbers, even though those numbers historically have been accurate by all independent sources. They found that Hamas's numbers are pretty spot on. Joe Biden has actually apologized for his statements, and he has backtracked, and he has said, I am sorry, but I'm disappointed in myself. I will do better. He said when he met with a group of Muslim leaders the next day, they showed him the casualties, their own deaths that they've experienced in their own families, their own lives. And they gave him the proof and showed him Hamas has been actually accurate each time there's been a war. The final Israeli numbers do end up corresponding with the Hamas numbers. And so then he apologized and said, I'm sorry, I'm disappointed in myself. I will do better. So we could trust these numbers by and large. If anything, they're probably underrepresented because there's a lot of people still buried in the rubble. And we don't know, if they could, I mean, just a lot of people buried under the rubble. And since the Palestinians aren't allowed to go back north, the IDF has told them, you can't come up north, even though there's been a ceasefire. A lot of people wanted to go back to their homes. They wanted to get more stuff. They wanted to find loved ones. And the IDF forbade them from going and traveling back north. When people attempted to, they got shot at. And Israel has been sending out these messages in Arabic over and over, telling the civilians, you're not allowed to go back north. You stay where you are. In fact, they're trying to push people who are in the south into a smaller portion. So people traveled from the north down to the south, and then they're now in the south. They're trying to get them from the southeast, the people in the southeast, over to the southwest part. So even in a smaller section, which we've covered before on the show. But I want to go over this combat civilian casualty ratio, and let's go over some past wars and see how this compares, this current ratio, at the ratio that they're at. When you're looking at, so if we say that so they're saying that the number, we'll round up just because we know there's people buried in the rubble. So we'll just say 25, just to make it easy on us, 20,500. And we'll say the number of Hamas fighters is 1,500 that have been killed. That is 19,000. You're looking at like a 19 to 1, 18 to 1 ratio, or maybe 15 to 1. So we'll say it's like a 15 to 1 ratio if we're going to be generous on this. We could even, I mean, you could even say 10 to 1 if you really want to be generous. It's still going to be way more than any other war in history. The Mexican Revolution, we're going to start there. The Mexican Revolution, there was a 1-to-1 ratio amongst combat deaths. There were a lot of, so this is where it gets a little tricky when it comes to combat civilian casualty ratios, because a lot of civilian deaths happen through famine and illness. And the numbers we're getting out of Gaza, those are people killed through airstrikes, shelling, bombs. That's how these people are being killed. They're not dying yet from famine and hunger and illnesses. That's not happening yet. Those numbers are yet to be seen when this war calms down and the people are living in these tiny cramped areas in the southern part of Gaza. And we'll see what kind of medical care they're given now that their hospitals are blown up. We'll see what kind of food they're given, if there's aid, that's enough aid, if there's enough food. In fact, Cindy McCain, Meghan McCain's mom, who's actually part of the World Food Program, she's the chief executive at the World Food Program, actually testified just the other day that they're getting to famine levels in Gaza. It's going to reach famine levels soon if food isn't reached, if people cannot get access to food. So we haven't even seen the famine deaths or the disease deaths. So keep that in mind. Now, the Mexican Revolution, there were quite a few people who died from disease and famine, but they believe that the combat ratio of actual civilians killed in combat situations, crossfire situations, 1-to-1 is what they're saying. So 1 civilian for every 1 combatant. World War I actually had an extremely, extremely low civilian casualty rate. The rate was extremely low because the war was fought on fronts where civilians were not, there were no civilians around. There were a lot of deaths from famine, a lot of deaths from disease during World War I. But as far as actual civilian deaths, out of the millions that died in World War I, the millions of combatants, there was only about 100 to 200,000 people who died directly from warfare. And that is because of chemicals that were used. And sometimes the winds carried the chemicals to these various towns. And then people died. And it was about 100 to 200,000 people who died during World War I in combat, sort of, from actual weaponry. World War II saw the worst carnage that any war had ever seen until this one. The death ratio, the civilian to combatant ratio was high. It was about 3 civilians for every 2 combatants. Some estimates say it was 2 civilians for every 1 combatant. That is because World War II obviously entailed the Holocaust. So you had people rounded up into camps, and you also had the dropping of nuclear weapons. There was also massive bombing of civilian areas of cities. So it was just absolutely devastation and destruction from World War II. Just the effectiveness of the lethality of all of these strategic weapons, which were used in all these population centers. So World War II, even though it was, let's say 2-to-1, that's quite a bit. That's about that 10, that's still not 10-to-1 or 19-to-1 or 15-to-1, which are the estimates that we're getting from the current war in Gaza. It's anywhere from 10-to-1 to 19-to-1. I mean, that's just atrocious. The Chechen Wars, Russia also used a lot of indiscriminate bombing. They were highly criticized for it. The Chechen Wars were probably the closest we're going to see to this, where they say that the civilian to combatant ratio was maybe 43 to 10 or 76 to 10 at a high rate. So that is still pretty high, or you know, you're looking at like a 7 to 1 ratio, anywhere from a 5 to 1 to a 7 to 1 ratio, 7 to 1 being very high for a modern war. And that with the Chechen Wars, where they had 4,000 separatist fighters were killed. If on the really high end, they give a civilian to combatant ratio of 10 to 1 for the Chechen War. So that would put us closer to what we're seeing in Israel against the Gazans. NATO and Yugoslavia, this is where things get weird. You know, we have a difficult time getting the numbers for any of the real modern wars. Once you start getting into NATO, Afghan War, Iraq War, certainly the Israelis, and we're going to get into that in all their different wars. But, you know, the numbers, it's always just comes down to how a person is categorized, if they're categorized as a combatant or not. So how do you determine who, especially, and this is the case when you look at the current war and the Israeli numbers that have come out over the years. When you study the various different conflicts that Israel has been in with Gaza, many say Israel looks like the most humane military ever. They say, wow, their civilian to combatant ratio is very low. In fact, normally they say it's below 1 to 1. It's like 0.4 to 1 or lower than that. And the ratio is so low that this makes, and you may have heard this term before, you may have heard people say Israel is the most humane military. They do the most that they can to prevent civilian casualties. That is only if you trust the Israelis' numbers. And that is because they have a tendency to label everybody a combatant. So it's easy to say our combatant to civilian ratio is really great. We're fantastic when you say everybody's Hamas. So if you're going to label everyone as Hamas, and if you have the ability to just kind of indiscriminately put that label on anybody, then you can actually lower your numbers and make a case that you're an extremely humanitarian military. I think, though, what's going on right now really calls that whole narrative into question, because we can see with our own eyes that they're just indiscriminately bombing all these civilians. And this is a new era. Previously, we just had to trust what the news told us, trust what the Israelis told us. We couldn't get that real-time information. We only had mainstream news down on the ground, and they were only feeding us usually a pro-Israel viewpoint. In fact, many of them couldn't even get access to the battlefields unless Israel gave them that access. Now with the internet, you've got Gazans on the ground, Gazans showing us the Gazan side of the story without the permission of Israel. Israel's having a difficult time controlling the narrative. And so we're seeing real hand, first account experience of what is actually going on the ground. So it's a lot harder for them to say they're all combatants. You know, how do you look at a 2-year-old child and then count them as a combatant? We're seeing that 2-year-old child. We're seeing the children. We're seeing the carnage. And we know these are not combatants. So they're having a more difficult time controlling that information narrative. But let's go back to NATO and Yugoslavia. They give a civilian, now, if NATO figures are to be believed, they give a figure of a kill ratio of about 1 civilian for every 10 combatants in that. But the Yugoslav government's figures are 4 civilians for every 1 combatant. So that's a big difference. And then in some of the numbers with some of the organizations on the Yugoslav side says 10 to 1, so 10 civilians to every 1 combatant. But of course, NATO saying, no, it's 1 civilian for every 10 combatants. Again, you get to say that if you just label everybody a combatant. If you say, well, everybody has got this ideology and therefore they're all enemy combatants, then it's easy to finagle your numbers. But quite a few independent sources say that it is closer to probably between that 4 to 1 and 10 to 1. So, you know, let's put them at like 6 or 7 to 1 to be fair, to kind of round that out. This is something that's kind of interesting. There was a Michael Oren. He was the ambassador to the Israeli ambassador to the United States. And this is what he had to say about the Yugoslav conflict and the numbers killed. Which he agreed with the 4 to 1 casualty ratio, 4 civilians to every 1. And this is kind of interesting because he said this, back in, this is years ago, where he makes this statement and he says, even the most moral army can make mistakes, especially in dense urban warfare. So this is the viewpoint, the thinking, those 4 civilians to 1 combatant, even the most moral army. So that's being the United States. The most moral army can make mistakes, especially in dense urban warfare, which is what Israel says now. So that was an Israeli ambassador to the United States saying exactly the same things that Israel says now. We're the most moral army. And, oh, well, it's dense urban warfare. We make mistakes. Afghan War, according to sources, believe that was 0.4 to 1, so 0.4 civilians, so half a civilian for every 1 casualty, roughly. Again, the numbers depend on how you count, for 1, a combatant, but 2, also how you're going to count the deaths. What I'd like to focus on, many of these wars, the deaths are including the famine and the disease deaths. But we don't have a chance to, that's not where we're at with Gaza. And we're already at like a 15 to 1. And yet we don't have any of those deaths yet. So you kind of keep that in mind as we're going through some of these numbers. Some of these include those famine deaths and those disease deaths, and others do not. Most of them do. Most of them include that. The Iraq War, here's one that doesn't include that. They believe that the civilian casualty rate was 77% because they believe that there were 174,000 casualties. And of those, 39,000 were combatants, or 40,000 were combatants, putting the casualty rate, the civilian casualty rate, at 77% of the deaths. Now, that might be the actual combat deaths, because we know that in Iraq, many, many, many more thousands of even children died, but many of them died from famine and disease. But even then, so then when you factor that in, you're looking at an atrocious war. Iraq War probably could rival what's going on here in Gaza, what's going on in Gaza. But even then, the combatant rates, the casualties to combatants just in the actual war is still, Israel is still way, way, way further out there with the civilian kills to combatants. U.S. drone strikes. So there's been a lot of questioning about this. Some believe that it is a 10 to 1 ratio, saying that 10 civilians to every 1 combatant is killed. But an ongoing study found that that is not the case. It started off really high at that level, but since then has had a decline, a steep decline over time. So now they're saying that the ratio is 1 to 5, so 1 civilian to every 5 combatants overall. Again, take these numbers with a grain of salt. You can only believe what you can believe. I mean, it's, how, when they tell you, well, because where are we getting this information? A lot of the numbers, the only sources we have are American sources, and they're saying, and they're, softening it and making it less than what it actually is. The Lebanon War. So this was this was an Israel-Lebanon fight. The Israelis invaded Lebanon, and that was a 6 to 1 ratio. That was very high, 6 civilians to every 1 combatant. And let's look at the current war again. We're looking at 19 to 1, or maybe 10 to 2, maybe 15 to 1. These are extremely high numbers, the highest out of any of these wars. And this is, the previous Israel conflicts with Gazans, again, those numbers are difficult to go through. They're about as transparent with their numbers as the Chinese, which is not very. And because they're trying to control the narrative. They're trying to control their the PR, the way the world views them, and they view that as an existential, that they need to be seen favorably on the world stage in order to have continued support for their fairly very new country. And so they control a lot of this narrative, and China does a lot of that same stuff for similar reasons. Not that China has any question of existence. You never hear the Chinese saying, we have the right to exist, our country has the right to exist. That is a question about Israel, because a lot of people do question the right of an ethno-nationalist state, of a nation that declares itself for the home of one group of ethnic people or religious people, and Nobody else really. Anybody else that's in that area is a second-class citizen. So they constantly have to, they constantly need to argue why they should be one of the only nations in the world that is actually an ethno-nationalist country. There's a lot of predominantly majority countries, a majority Christian or majority Muslim or majority white or majority black. We see that all around the world, but it isn't ingrained in their constitution or in their basic laws that this country is just for this group of people and anybody else is an outsider. Anybody else will never be given equal rights. They're never going to be given equality because this is a home for one particular group of people. So they constantly have to justify their existence because a lot of people question whether or not that should be okay in a Western civilization. So these are the numbers. I mean, basically, and again, let me just go through some of, I do want to go through some of these previous wars, like the 2008-2009 Gaza war. Analysts have attempted to calculate the IDF civilian casualty ratio. All have noted that the ratio differs significantly depending on which figures are used regarding the total number of casualties and their identity. So again, who's a combatant? How do you label them? The numbers are varied depending on who you talk to. So it's really unclear with Israel. They said that, okay, so then the Israel in the 2014 Gaza war, again, same sort of thing. Numbers vary widely. Numbers for all of these other wars are fairly simple to come across and find. The minute you start going into Israel-Gaza wars, suddenly the research gets crazy. I mean, try the numbers, the various numbers, the information. It is a propaganda game that is clearly being played compared to all the other wars. I mean, you can go through, like I did today, the Mexican War, the World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea. I mean, you go through all these wars and they give you numbers, pretty straightforward numbers. And then you hit Israel, Gaza, and it's like, numbers are all over the place. It depends on who you ask. That tells you a lot right there. But they do say that they are the most moral, that they've had the lowest ratio ever known of civilian combatant ratio, which already right there makes a person wonder, you know, if you're the best ever after what we've just seen, after what we're witnessing right now. And you've been saying for years, we're the best ever at this. We kill fewer civilians than combatants out of any other country in the world. We are the most moral army in the world. And yet we're seeing the carnage that we're seeing. It makes all of those questions, all of those numbers come into question for sure. But as of right now, the one thing we need to know is that the current war stands at actual killed in combat civilians. We're looking at, if we're generous, 10-2. Let me tell you about my favorite sheets and blankets. And I know they have a lot of really other wonderful stuff. They got pajamas and socks and all kinds of stuff. Cozy Earth. I personally, though, use their sheets. I also have one of their amazing blankets on the bed, and it is just really, truly the softest, most comfortable sheets and bedding that I have ever used. It just is temperature regulating. It is, I don't have a better word for it other than cozy. Kind of lame because it's cozy. I wish I could, but really they're cozy. They're cozy. So I really sleep so much better when I hate it when I have to put these in the wash and then I have to put on a different set of sheets. I'm always waiting to get these out of the wash so that I can put them back on the bed. They really are just soft, breathable, temperature regulating. It's been colder. I'm so warm in the summer. I stayed so cool. It's just incredible how well they work in both seasons. And if you don't agree, so if you order them, you don't agree, they're going to refund your purchase price plus shipping, no questions asked, and you're going to get 100 nights to try them out. I am going to be asking for one of their robes for Christmas. That's what I want from my husband. I'm going to tell him I need a robe because I'm always stealing his robe, but this one looks so much cozier. So I want one of those. Now, how can Cozy Earth make such a guarantee? Because the bedding is made from viscose from bamboo, so it traps less heat, enabling people to sleep more comfortably year-round. And here's my gift to you this holiday season. Go to CozyEarth.com and enter code Iversen to save up to 40%. That's CozyEarth.com with code Iversen to save up to 40%. And I'm going to be sending my husband there right after the show and saying 40%. Christmas gift. Get me one of those robes. because they are really great.